Hello and welcome to Sam-Splaining Science. I'm Sam. I'm your host. I'll be Sam-Splaining the science. And today, I smell snow. That's a quote from Gilmore Girls, if you didn't know. If you did know, that's why we're friends. If we didn't know, that's okay. We're still friends. But today's episode, we're talking about snow because it's winter. And it's been snowing a decent amount here in New York. So I figured, let's talk about snow. How it's formed and how come when we put salt on it, it melts. What's that about? We'll get into it. But before we get into the science of that, hi, how are you? I hope you're doing well. I hope your January is going well. We are on episode 2 of 2026. So we're already halfway to where we were in 2025, which is pretty awesome. But I have to be 100% transparent. I am this close to throwing my computer out the window because I just filmed this entire episode and then hit stop recording. And my computer said, your recording is corrupted and you won't ever see this file ever again. And guess what? I couldn't find it. Yes. So here we are recording again. And I made it a big point the first time that I recorded it that I'm recording at night after I worked all day and that I was very tired and brain dead. But I literally, if I don't record it tonight, it won't get recorded for another week and a half. So I have to do it today. So here we are. And you better like it. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, I'm going to move on because if I think about it anymore, I'm going to cry. Okay. So, we're going to talk about snow today. And I think while I was researching for this episode and drafting my notes for this episode, it was snowing actively. And I was like, wow, it is so beautiful and so serene and calm and magical. And like, I get why Lorelai Gilmore loved the snow so much. But then I went outside and I was like, I could live without this, actually. You know, I'm good. I could do without this forever, for the rest of my life, actually. I hate this crap. I hate it so much. I mean, it's cold. It's wet. I like walked to the gym with my gym shoes and they were soaked. And I'm like, why? Why do bad things happen to good people? That's the mood for tonight because my first episode got erased. Okay, I promise I'll get over it. I might bring it up a couple more times, but I'll get over it. Okay. This is all to say that snow is beautiful when you're inside, but when you're outside in it, it is the worst. And even the remnants, like after a snow, like icy roads, icy sidewalks, I'm done. I literally, like, I can't navigate my own neighborhood. I can't take a walk for my own mental health in the middle of the winter, the seasonal depression era. I can't go for a walk without tearing an ACL because there's ice on the ground. I hate it. And then in the places where there aren't ice, where they put down rock salt, and we'll talk about that, about how come rock salt makes it less icy. The places that put rock salt down, the rock salt gets stuck in my boots and it stains my boots. And then I bring it into my house and I don't wear shoes in my house. I take them off at my front door, but like the whole like front door area, there's like salt pebbles. And I'm like, what? This is why I need a winter house in Bali. That's what I need. That would help a lot of my problems right now. But unfortunately, I'm here. And I shouldn't say that. I love living in New York from April to December. I love it. I would never, ever, ever even conceive an idea of leaving until January through March. Get me the hell out of here. I hate it, man. I hate it. But let's not be negative because I could certainly spiral right now if I let myself, but I'm not going to let myself. We're going to move on and we're going to talk about science because that's what I do. I sam-splain science. And today's questions are, what is snow? And why does salt melt ice? These questions are not really elegant. I acknowledge that. But they are what they are. And you're getting a version of Sam that I fear none of you, or not many of you, have seen. Normally when I film this, I'm energetic. Usually I film on a weekend where I've gotten all of my sleep and I'm ready to talk about science, but I worked all day and my brain is tired. And I filmed this once already. So you're going to get what you're going to get. And I'm sorry. I'm going to do my best. But mind you, I already did my best and it got deleted. So I'm letting it go now for real. Let's talk about what snow is, guys. Let's move on. As always, the sources for this episode are linked in the description. I encourage you. Oh, this is something I wanted to talk about. I'm rubbing my eyes because I'm crying. No, just kidding. But my eyes are itchy. I cite my sources in the description in every episode so that you can fact check me. I encourage you to look at the resources that I use. And if you find anything different, I encourage you to reach out to me and tell me. I'm on Instagram more than I'd like to admit. TikTok too. So you can send me messages and let me know, hey, Sam, what you said was wrong, or you missed something, or whatever. I want to know that because as much as I love to samsplain, I'm not perfect. And if I miss something, I want to know about it. So I would like to give a big shout out to my friend Adrian, who listened to the AI episode that came out. And he let me know that there are versions of ChatGPT that are connected to the internet. So I'm sorry for being so mean to ChatGPT, but not really. But I acknowledge that there are versions that are connected to the internet. So there may be instances in which case they are able to provide more up-to-date information. So thank you, Adrian, for the correction. And my apologies for misguiding the other 3 of you who listened. No, but seriously, I wanted to acknowledge that now. And then encourage you, for if I ever say anything else inaccurate, please let me know. Because I'd like to be accountable for the things that I say. Thank you. Okay. Now, moving on to what is snow. The short answer is that snow is frozen rain. But you know darn well that when I samsplain a question, it's never one sentence. So we're going to get a bit more granular with what that means. What is snow? And we're going to start with a little bit of a high school chemistry flashback. Apologies. There's going to be a couple of those in this episode. We're going to start by talking about atoms. If you recall, atoms, ATOMS. I know I kind of say it like the name Adam, but that's just the way it is sometimes. If your name is Adam and you're listening to this, sorry. So atoms are the smallest subunit, the smallest building block of matter. Matter being solid, liquid, gas. I almost said person, place, or thing, which is true. Those are people and things. Places could be matter, I guess. Yeah. Whatever. I'm so tired. I'm so over this. Okay. Atoms are the smallest subunits of matter. And atoms can connect to one another to form molecules. And they connect by forming bonds between neighboring atoms to form a molecule. And then molecules can form bonds with other molecules that are neighboring and nearby. So the example that we're going to talk about today is water. Water is a molecule that is made up of 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom, H2O. And the formation of these atoms to make a water molecule kind of looks like a Mickey Mouse, where the oxygen is bigger. It's like Mickey Mouse's head. And then the 2 hydrogens are like Mickey Mouse's ears. And they kind of form this like triangle looking a triangle of spheres, we'll call it. And that's 1 molecule of water. But a molecule of water can interact with its surroundings, including other molecules of water. And it does that through a hydrogen bond, where a hydrogen, or one of Mickey Mouse's ears of one water molecule, tends to be attracted to the oxygen or the face of another Mickey Mouse water molecule, if that makes sense. And depending on a couple of different things in the environment, like air pressure, but we're not going to open that can of worms today. But depending on the temperature, water can exist as a solid, a liquid, or a gas. A solid as ice below its freezing point, which in Celsius is 0 degrees Celsius. In Fahrenheit is 32 degrees Fahrenheit. So any water below those temperatures tends to be solid as ice. A liquid, which we know is liquid water, between the freezing and the boiling points. And then as a gas or as a vapor at anything higher than water's boiling point, which is 100 degrees Celsius or 212 degrees Fahrenheit. So one thing to note is that water molecules kind of arrange themselves at a certain distance depending on this temperature. And that's what determines the state of matter that the water's in. So at higher temperatures, where there's a little more energy and a little more space in a given space, water molecules are going to want to spread out really far. And that's when they're going to be more present as a gas, as vapor, when they're not really touching at all and they completely fill the volume of the room or the chamber, wherever it is in. So that's water vapor as a gas, where they're all spread out, and those hydrogen bonds between the water molecules are really weak because they're so far. At room temperature, when water is a liquid, the water molecules are closer together. So you can think about it like water in a glass, where we can see the water all together. And I'm having trouble explaining this. I did it pretty well like an hour ago. But it's not, so you can see the water and it's together, but it's not like rigid. Like it's fluid. That's why, it's fluid, if you can believe. Fluid water, fluid liquid water, where you can kind of shape shift it. It's not going to hold a given shape. It holds the shape of the container that it's in. And that's when water is liquid at room temperature. Solid water at temperatures below the freezing point, like an ice cube, right? An ice cube holds its shape. You can shake an ice cube, you can, twist it, you can whatever. It's going to stay that given shape. And that's because the structure of the water molecules are so tightly packed within that ice cube that it forms that rigid structure, and it keeps to that shape until the temperature changes to a point where it melts and becomes liquid at a temperature above 0 Celsius or 32 Fahrenheit. And then if the temperature continues to rise, those molecules will continue to spread out and get to a point where it's at its boiling point, where it will go from liquid to gas and continue to go from liquid water to water vapor, continue spreading out away from other water molecules. So the takeaway here is that the colder the temperature, the stronger those hydrogen bonds are, the more structure there is, and the closer those molecules are together to form a solid ice cube. At warmer temperatures, the molecules can spread out a little bit more and become a little less rigid and more flexible, until eventually, if they evaporate and become water vapor, they're so spread out that they're like barely interacting with one another. So now getting back to our short answer, which is that snow is frozen rain. I read a really interesting article in American Scientist. It was an online article. The link is below, of course. It was written by Dr. Ken Lebrecht, and he explains the formation of snowflakes in the air as it snows, and how that forms from like an individual singular water crystal into the significant flakage that we see falling from the sky. So snow crystals form when warmer, moist air, sorry, that's what my notes say. I hate saying that word, but whatever. When that air collides with a different mass of air, and that causes a, quote, weather front. Did you think we'd be talking about meteorology today? Believe it. So if that warmer, moist air is pushed upward in this collision, the air will cool as it rises, meaning that the water vapor in that air will force the molecules closer together. Because again, as the temperature gets lower, water molecules become closer together, right? And that changes the water vapor into liquid water as water droplets. And those water droplets form around just like dust particles that are in the air to form clouds. And if the cloud continues to cool and get colder, those droplets, singular droplets, begin to freeze. And when one droplet freezes, oh, my radiator has something to say. No, she's good. Okay. When one droplet freezes and makes one singular frozen snowdrop, it expands and it grows because it's not existing in a vacuum. It's going to continue bumping into other water molecules in that cloud. And with each water molecule that it, as a vapor or as a liquid or even as a solid, it will grow. And because it will freeze the water or freeze the vapor that it interacts with. And because of this process, there's like a characteristic crystal lattice structure that we know as a snowflake. Snowflakes have six-fold symmetry. So you could basically fold them 6 ways and they'll like be mirror images of one another. And the very first snow droplet that is sort of the, what's the word? Like the starting point, I guess, for building into these very complex crystalline structures are typically the size of 1/10 of a strand of hair. So hair strands, depending on the thickness of your hair, my hair is very thin and very fine, but a hair strand can be between 50 to 100 microns or micrometers in width. The very first droplet that makes a snowflake is only a few microns in width or in size. So like 1/10 of my hair strand is a singular starting point of a snowflake. And it continues to just sort of bounce around the cloud and interact with water and water vapor. And it just grows into this beautiful crystalline structure that Dr. Lebrecht has shown both as sort of a like a cartoon example of some typical snowflake patterns that we see, but also is as images from crystallography based on X-ray diffraction techniques. So you're able to see actual snowflakes as well as like, I guess, artistic renderings of them as well in the article and also on the slide if you watch on YouTube. So as these crystals continue to build on each other within the snow cloud, they get bigger. And as they get bigger, they get heavier. And one thing about gravity is it's going to get you. It's going to get you whether you're a bitch slipping and sliding on the sidewalk after a fresh snow, or if you're a beautiful crystalline snowflake in a cloud. Gravity's going to get you either way. And that's what causes, as the snowflake gets bigger and gets heavier, it falls to the ground, and that's how we see snow. So that's actually quite beautiful, but it's also quite evil. And don't forget that. When it snows and you say, wow, it looks so beautiful, so peaceful, don't go outside. Don't go outside. Don't have to shovel. I mean, I live in an apartment, so I don't have to shovel. But when I visit my family and their house, over Christmas break, I had to shovel a driveway. And that was not ideal, not fun. So as beautiful as it looks from the inside, just remember, evil. Just kidding. But I'm not kidding, though, because who here, raise your hand if you've been personally victimized by an icy sidewalk. Both of my hands are up. Multiple times. And that brings us actually to our next question, which is, why does salt melt snow/ice? As a way to prevent sidewalks and roads from getting too slippery and too icy, you may have seen that people put down rock salt. I've already complained about it. I'm not going to do it again, but you know my thoughts on rock salt in my home. But on the sidewalk, does a pretty good job, I have to say. As much as I hate it, does a pretty good job of keeping the sidewalk not too slippery. But how does that work? How does that happen? The answer to that is that salt dissolves in water. That's like step one of the answer. So salt is usually made up of like a couple of atoms that are charged. So they're ions. And they have one positive charge, and they're half positively charged, half negatively charged. And they come together. A typical example that you may hear of is sodium chloride, which is NaCl. That's table salt. And at room temperature, in, not water, in air, sodium chloride prefers to, be together as like a little grain of salt. And it's, love that for it. But if you drop salt in water and stir it up, it will dissolve. And basically that process of dissolving salt means that the sodium, the positive charge, and the chloride, the negative charge, are going to separate from each other and kind of float around in the water. And when these ions separate from one another and float around in the water, they're encouraging the water molecules to sort of separate from each other, to space out a little bit. Now, remember from a couple slides ago that the distance of water molecules can determine the state of matter that water is in, right? So when water molecules are really spread out, they're gas. When they're kind of close together, but not super rigid, liquid. When they're stuck together in a formation that's like a rigid ice cube, that is a solid. So when the water molecules are more spread out, they're becoming more liquid gas than solid. One thing to keep in mind there. So when you add salt to ice or frozen water, the salt immediately starts dissolving on the ice. However much liquid might be on the very top layer of an ice cube or of ice on a sidewalk, that salt is going to start dissolving into that water. And then as it dissolves, this salt will again, push the water molecules apart from each other. And in doing so, will decrease the freezing point of water in a phenomenon that we call freezing point depression. I call freezing point depression around this time in winter, actually, when I'm like, why is it so cold? It's so freezing. I'm sad. But freezing point depression in chemistry is a phenomenon where the freezing point of a solvent, such as water, something that you dissolve things into, can be reduced by, in this case, adding salt. So let's talk about this. We can measure the change in a freezing point temperature, or really the decrease of the freezing point temperature in this case, using the Van't Hoff equation, where the change in freezing point, the change in temperature, is equal to a couple of different factors, where one factor is the Van't Hoff factor of the solute, which is the thing that is getting dissolved into the water, in our case, salt. So this Van't Hoff factor is specific for a type of salt that you use. It also considers the Kf, which is the solvent, or the thing that is, why are words so hard for me? The thing that the salt is getting dissolved into. So in this case, water. The solvent freezing point constant. And that's constant regardless of the solvent. So for ice, it's going to be a certain constant, like water, ice, certain constant. And then the last thing that it considers is the molality of the solution. So molality is a measure essentially of like the amount of salt divided by the amount of ice, where the amount of salt is measured in a unit called moles. And this is another high school chemistry flashback. I'm sorry. But essentially, this considers the, like it's an amount of a molecule like NaCl, sodium chloride, table salt, whatever you want to call it. It'll tell you the amount, like a mole of sodium chloride is based on the molecular makeup of sodium chloride, so the molecular weight, and something called Avogadro's number, 6.022 times 10 to the 23rd. If you know, you know. So essentially, it's just one way to measure. Instead of saying like, oh, 6 grams of salt, it's like 1 mole of salt, but it tells you not how much it weighs, but like how many NaCl molecules are in that amount, if that makes sense. So the real takeaway that I want to focus on here is not the specifics of the Van't Hoff equation. It's really to take away that the higher the molality, meaning the higher the amount of salt per unit of ice, and or the higher the Van't Hoff factor, which again is the solute or salt specific factor, will result in a lower freezing point, which means that if you have a salt that has a high Van't Hoff factor and has high molality, so you use a lot of this salt per kilogram of ice, that will lead to a greater decrease in the freezing point. So the freezing point will go from 0 degrees Celsius to maybe negative 15 degrees Celsius. So if you add a salt that, will reduce that freezing point by 15 degrees Celsius, and the air temperature outside is minus 5 degrees Celsius, then at the temperature that it is outside, that ice can exist as liquid because the freezing point is now minus 15 instead of 0. Does that make sense? Did I say that right? I said that right. So hopefully that's clear that when you add salt, it lowers the freezing point so that water can exist as a liquid instead of a solid for lower temperatures below the original freezing point. And one paper that I found that kind of talks about this. I think it did a really good job, but it's from a journal called Journal of Emerging Investigators, which is a journal that publishes scientific research by high school and college students. So is this going to be the most elegant paper? Probably not. No shade to the high schoolers. I didn't have a published paper in high school, so snaps. It's probably not going to be the most elegant paper. It's not MIT material, but I think it had a pretty nice, scientific approach. And I think it explained and showed really well the difference between different types of salt and their impact on the freezing point of ice. So in this paper by Segal and Wright, they did a little experiment to see how different solutes, so different types of salt, change the freezing point of ice blocks based on how much ice will melt for a given amount of salt added to the block of ice at 4 degrees Celsius or 39-ish degrees Fahrenheit. So they explored 4 types of salt: sodium chloride, which is table salt, calcium chloride, magnesium sulfate, and trisodium citrate. They also had a 5th ice block that was a control that did not receive any salt on it whatsoever. What they would do is they would gradually add salt by a measurement of moles to an ice block. Wait 25 minutes. Well, actually, the high schooler did a bit better job of explaining this than I did, I swear. They would take a block of ice. They would weigh it. They would put a certain amount of salt on the ice block and a measurement of moles, not a measurement of grams or whatever. They would actually measure molecules of sodium chloride or calcium chloride or whatever. Put the salt on the ice, wait 25 minutes, and then weigh the ice block again to take the difference. And that would tell them how much ice melted because of the salt. And they also had the control ice block, which did not have any salt on it. And they reported that the control block, which isn't shown on this graph here, but the control block had no water melt off. And again, that's because the block was held at 4 degrees Celsius, pretty close to freezing. So not super conducive to melting ice and melting snow. But what they did show for the other types of ice were that, for example, calcium chloride, sodium chloride or table salt, and magnesium sulfate, is that they had increasing melt volume. So the ice melted more at increasing concentrations of the salt, or increasing moles of salt, for those 3 types of salt. For the 4th type of salt, trisodium citrate, there was actually not a significant increase in melt volume when they added more of that salt. They actually saw a little bit of an inverse relationship. And what was really cool, I thought, was that in a table in the paper that kind of outlined the chemical structures and chemical properties of each type of salt that they used. And they calculated like a theoretical freezing point depression based on each salt's Van 't Hoff factor and the molality, or the saturated molality of the solution with the salt and the ice. And what they found was that calcium chloride, which had the greatest increase in melt volume per increase in moles of salt, it had the highest, one of the highest Van 't Hoff factors and the highest saturated molality, which resulted in the greatest theoretical freezing point depression, which would make sense because if the freezing point was reduced by the most amount, that would mean that more of the ice would exist at a liquid phase of matter than at a solid phase of matter at lower temperatures. And it did that a lot faster than, for example, sodium chloride, which had, moderate Van Hoff and saturated molality. So I just thought that was pretty interesting. And then on the other end of the spectrum, the trisodium citrate, which had sort of this like inverse reaction that compared to the other types of salt, they reported that even though it had the highest Van Hoff factor of 4, it had the lowest molality. And again, that just means that when you're looking at the equation of the Van Hoff equation for looking at the freezing point depression, it depends on all of those factors. So if you have a very low molality, that would mean that it doesn't really impact the freezing point depression as much as a salt that has a very high molality. That was a lot of word vomit. I hope that wasn't too chaotic. But I thought that was pretty interesting and really cool to share. One thing that I also wanted to note, or maybe I'll mention this on the next slide too. I'll go to the next slide. So one other thing that they looked at in this study was something called like saturation, where they wanted to see if there was such thing as like too much salt, or like, was there a perfect amount of salt to add where any amount above this salt would just be like kind of pointless and not have an impact on the melting or like the freezing point of the ice. And they showed data for both NaCl, sodium chloride or table salt, and calcium chloride. And what they showed that was for the NaCl, the table salt, they did kind of see this sort of saturation curve where they added like 0.2 moles of salt, like kind of gradually. So they started at 0.5, they started at 0.05, went to 0.1, 0.15, 0.2, and it sort of like increased in a linear fashion. Then when they added 0.4 moles of salt, the amount of melt volume was like pretty consistent with what they saw at 0.2 moles of salt. So essentially, adding any amount of salt over 0.2 moles didn't really change the amount of ice that melted. Whereas for the calcium chloride, they're starting to kind of see a saturation effect where the amount of, the higher up they go in concentration of calcium chloride might not exactly follow like the linear trajectory that they see at low levels. But overall, it's like pretty close to linear, where they have, at about 0.2, or I guess it's 0.16 moles of salt, they had about 60 milliliters of ice melt. And then if you double it to go up to about 0.32, they had about 100 milliliters of ice melt. Did I say salt melt? Sorry, I meant ice melt. But that's just to say that it's not going to be a direct double. Like, it's not exactly a linear relationship once you get up to that point, but it's close. And I think that just really speaks to the different properties of the salt and how you can use these different salts with their different properties to have increasing effects, right? If you want to melt a lot of salt, maybe don't use sodium chloride or don't use too much of the sodium chloride. But if you want to melt a lot of salt and not use too much, I keep saying melt a lot of salt. See, this is why I have to go to bed. It's too late. I've done this once before. If it doesn't work now, I'm deleting my account. If this recording deletes itself, you will never hear from me again. And that's a promise. Not really, but I'll be really pissed. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is it's interesting how the different properties of the different salts can result in changes or different changes in the freezing point depression. And we can kind of use that to our advantage. So for example, when you go to the hardware store and you buy rock salt for your sidewalks or your streets or whatever, usually it's a combination of sodium chloride and calcium chloride and magnesium chloride and all those other salts. And it's interesting to kind of combine them because they have kind of different impacts. So a combination of them could, have like depending on what the air temperature is outside, it could kind of cover a wide range of freezing points, right? Because if a certain amount of NaCl only decreases the freezing point by, 2 degrees, and it's 18 degrees Fahrenheit outside, but the freezing point depression was only decreased to 30 degrees, you're still going to have frozen sidewalks. Whereas if calcium chloride reduces the freezing point of ice by 20 degrees, that 32 degrees Fahrenheit freezing point becomes 12 degrees Fahrenheit, and it's 18 degrees outside, we're swimming. We're splashing in puddles at that point. So I don't know. I just thought it was kind of cool and interesting to think about, especially because I see it all the time now. There's salt everywhere. Every day, people are just tossing it out. So now we know how it works. There's a couple of other things that I was going to try to talk about, but I didn't have the time to research. But some considerations, like pros and cons, I guess. Pros are that rock salt for melting ice is very effective, and it keeps our roads safe and our sidewalks safe. That's obviously good. But some considerations, there are some environmental impacts. So especially if you're in an area where there's runoff water that runs off into bodies of water, like lakes and rivers and that sort of thing. There are some considerations there about, adding salts to those. If there's fish in the water and, you don't want to mess with the salt content or whatever. Just some things to think about there. Also, it stains your shoes. It gets stuck to the bottom of your boots, and it scratches your floors. So another thing to consider. The environment, yeah, whatever. But what about my boots? That was a joke, obviously. Okay. Summary. We made it. The summary is very lackluster. It's not very elegant, but that's because I was in a rush. Can you believe I was in a rush? And then I spent so long recording the first episode, and then it decided to not save. I'm still not over it. I thought I'd be over it by now. I'm not. It's just ironic that I was in such a rush, and then now I'm literally spending double the amount of time on this. So that's super fun. Yay. Okay. Summary. Today we talked about how water can exist at different states of matter, solid, liquid, and gas, and about the different properties of how the molecules interact with one another at different temperatures can result in which phase of matter water is. So when water molecules are super close and tightly packed together in a cold temperature, that's going to be an ice cube. It's going to be solid. If they're a little more spread out and a little more loosey-goosey at a room temp, that's going to be liquid. And then if they're super far apart and barely interacting with one another, and they're, coming off of a boiling pot of water and they're vaporizing, that's going to be water vapor. And all the water molecules interact with each other differently depending on what state of matter that they're in. And we also talked about how salt decreases the freezing point of water, which means that liquid can remain at a liquid below the typical freezing points when we dissolve salt on ice. So essentially reducing the temperature that it takes for water to freeze, so that if we throw salt on ice at 32 degrees Fahrenheit, the freezing point of that ice will reduce to maybe 20 degrees Fahrenheit, maybe 10 degrees Fahrenheit, maybe 0 degrees Fahrenheit. But that will allow for the water to exist as a liquid and not ice, not solid, which makes it safer conditions for driving, for walking, etc. And then the last point I want to make here has nothing to do with anything that I talked about today, but it kind of does in a way when you think about it. If you know me and you've listened to any episode of the show, especially the politically charged ones, you know that I'm not shy about sharing my opinion. And my opinion is that this podcast has been, will forever be, an abolish ice space. All my homies hate ice, and the immigration custom enforcement in the United States is, I mean, I don't even have words. And I kind of went on a rant the first time I recorded this, and I'm going to try to have better words this time around, but they are inciting terror in communities. They are harassing people who are, just trying to live their lives. They are separating and tearing apart families. And it is completely and totally unacceptable. And it's disgusting and despicable and sad. And I can't believe that this is what is happening in a time where we are alive. I'm just sick. I'm sick thinking about it. I have not ever, and I will not ever stand for that. In my community, in my country, I don't have the words other than I am sick to my stomach over this. And, like I do when I'm passionate about something and I'm sick to my stomach over something, I try to find things that I can do. I'm not an immigration lawyer, but I can donate to mutual aid funds that support fees for immigration lawyers to help immigrant communities. So I've linked a couple of places and organizations that I've donated to. If you feel so inclined, please feel free to donate as well. It's the Women's Fund of Minnesota. They have an Immigrant Rapid Response Fund, and the Immigrant Law Center of Minnesota. Obviously, the two that I recently donated to are in Minnesota because that's where ICE has been terrorizing communities. They've been terrorizing communities all over the country, but most dramatically in Minnesota. So I've donated there. If you have any other places that you recommend I check out to donate, please let me know, because this is something I feel so powerless, but I know that I'm not. And you shouldn't feel that way either. Even if you can't donate, using your voice, speaking out, sharing information are all just very valuable at this point in history. So I encourage you to do what you can, whether it's donating or not is totally fine, but do what you can. And honestly, just take care of your neighbors. That's what I'm asking you to do. Take care of your neighbors. Whether it's your next door neighbor or your neighboring state. Minnesota does not neighbor New York. Actually, if I'm being completely vulnerable with you, I couldn't point to Minnesota on a map. That's sad. But I care about them, and I'm going to support them. I'm going to do everything that I can. And I'm proud of them and the response that they've put up to this aggressive, terror-invoking force. So I love you, Minnesota. And just protect your neighbor, no matter where they come from, because at the end of the day, borders aren't real. And that's always going to be my take. You can quote me on that. Put that on my tombstone. Borders aren't real. You go fly up into space and you look down at Earth, there are no borders. So we're all God's children, or whatever the hell you want to say. All right, let's cut it there because I am starting to vent again. Okay, so that's all for this week. Please don't forget to follow, rate, and review the podcast wherever you are tuning in, and you can subscribe on YouTube, please. You can also follow the show on social media at samsplainingsci, and you can ask me questions there if you'd like. You can also ask me questions at samsplainingscience.com/ask. So if you have anything that you'd like to have Sam explain to you, ask away. Thank you very much for tuning in to this week's episode. I hope you learned a little bit, and I hope you laughed a little bit, and I will talk to you the next time that I talk to you. Bye.